Okay. So the idea behind these sessions is that, see, we are gradually migrating over to Angular, the newer versions of Angular, right? So given that there is a major learning curve which comes up, this is because and the newer versions of Angular is it has a few quirks which are very different from the older Angular series or any other framework for that matter. And you also have the RxJS, which actually also has a pretty decent learning curve, but it actually is very helpful if you actually understand what is happening on the project. Okay. So the point of these sessions is to cover patterns, a bunch of stuff which you would probably find somewhere on the internet, but it would be spread all over. Okay. So to cover these topics in a way that it's easy to digest and remember, and also to have them in some place. Okay. So since we would be having these things regularly, it makes sense that you guys feel free to ask any questions that you have. I'll try to keep these sessions as short as possible so as to cover like small portions every day. But it also implies that I won't be able to create presentations and stuff like that, and it will mostly be screencasts where I'll live code, and I'll probably be making 100,000 mistakes and fix them on the way. Okay? So yeah, one of the things I would like you guys to do is like to have Angular CLI installed. So you can go to this cli.angular.io and npm install -d. This first line you have to execute. Okay? So once this is done, you would be able to create an Angular application and stuff. Okay. So I'm assuming you guys have already done this, or is there anyone remaining to do this? Just put in the chat box. Okay, guys. Okay, I'm assuming you guys, all of you guys have Angular CLI installed. Okay. Okay. So this is our empty folder right now. I have my VS Code open. My current node version is 10.15.3. In case you guys are working in the older node version, there might be complications which come up. So I'll prefer that you start with 10.15.3. Okay. So I'll be covering the very basics of Angular in case you guys are not very familiar with this thing. So if you are starting a new project in Angular, what you do is do ng new. Let's call this. Mm, let's make a bean calendar. Okay. Okay. Routing. Yes, we want Angular routing. SCS is what we use. Do not go for CSS. It's a pain in the ass to write so much stuff. Okay. Continue installing for a while. Okay, this takes a while. I'm assuming you guys are following along, right? So do ng new mean calendar in some folder. Okay. What this would do is it will create the whole application. So ng refers to the Angular CLI. That is the command line interface which you can use, which has a bunch of helpful commands, which allows you to do a bunch of stuff. Okay. So most in 100% of the cases, you would be creating a new application with this. In case you're not, you're probably using a boilerplate for something. Okay. So this takes a little while. Are Meanwhile, I'll take out the. Um, okay, hello. So, do you have Angular CLI installed? Like, if you want to follow along. Ellie.
Hello, you're asking me?
Yes, yes, yes. I think, do you have Angular CLI installed?
No.
Okay. Go to cli.angular.io and just run the first command over here. npm install -c at the rate of Angular statue. Okay. Without this, you won't be able to follow along. Okay.
Yeah.
What? After that, you would have to come over here and ng new. I'm calling this application a new calendar, but they'll call it whatever. Okay? And that would ask you for Angular routing, which you go for yes, and style sheet you will go for SCC. Okay? So let's start now once this thing will stop. Okay. Okay. And for okay, so in the meanwhile, I'll cover a few more things. So while the installation is going on, I'll be using two libraries. Okay, because see, ideally I can show you the stuff without using any sort of libraries. But if you're working on the Angular, you'll probably be using 100,000 libraries because no one actually uses just the framework, right? So mostly we use Angular material, and getting started material in Angular is like very easy. Okay. You just have to run one command within the CLI, which is ng-add @Angular. Just add everything over here. Okay. Material, why do we use these things? Because material gives you a bunch of components similar to what we have in Angular. Okay. But the thing is, like, even though they provide a bunch of components, you might find you need some stuff like which are like more something more robust or something which are more like complex or something. Okay. For that thing, you want to use something like PrimeNG. Okay. PrimeNG is another Angular UI component library which has a bunch of ready-made stuff. Okay. And by ready-made, I think like any proper use case you can think of, PrimeNG covers it. The minor problem you might face is that PrimeNG has a styling which is similar to Bootstrap rather than Material, so you might have to do a few stuff. But it has 100,000 components over here, which more or less covers any use case you might have. Okay. So this might be something worth exploring later on, but right now I'll just go to Material and full calendar. So what full calendar is? Full calendar allows you to create a calendar inside your application with one single component. So what are components? I'll come to. Okay. So once the the new Angular application has been created, you would probably want to run this, right? So the command to run something is ng space serve. Okay.
Go into the directory. There.
Oh, sorry. This will take a while. I'll run through a few more Angular CLI commands in the meanwhile, and a few things which are already present. Okay. So if you open up the SRC folder which was generated, you'll see you have certain folders, app, assets, environments, and a bunch of files. Okay. Polyfills.ts, main.ts, test.ts, you can ignore from it. Okay. Style.scs is the global styling field. Okay. Index.html is kind of the entry file which gets used when the distributions are created, but you can kind of ignore everything which is here. Okay. Environment refers to the corresponding environment variables which would get placed inside when you serve the application. That is, if you're using Firebase or something like that, you would have a bunch of client-side fields, right, which you will be putting over here, and like client secret and those things. So if you want to choose the environment for that particular thing, you can keep them over here. And ng serve ke saath, if you put ng serve -c space production, it will use this instead of using this file, it will use this file. Okay. And this is defined inside angular.json, which is, so you would have to change the add that thing inside build configurations and serve wala configuration. Serve here, yes. So I'll cover this thing later on, how to add a new environment. But right, because we use that in our mobile app by creating a staging environment also. But it's not exactly the one of the very big stuff. Okay. Assets is supposed to keep your images and stuff, and the app folder is about keeping is housing the main application, that is the actual TypeScript color components and stuff like that. Okay. So see, for very simple applications, you would want to create components directly over here, but you would want a lazily loaded or module-based structure when you're creating a larger application. I'll cover those later. Okay. Right now, I'll just walk you through what is over here. So app component.html or TS, this component is essentially where your application starts. Okay. This is the starting point of your application. And this app module TS is the portion where your application actually properly starts. So this is Bootstrap defines for a given so what is a module inside Angular? A module is a specific, what can you say, a domain or a particular section inside the application which defines a cohesive block. Okay. Or a particular portion of the application which defines something regarding one क्या बोलते हैं उसको? One can't think of a proper term. A module would refer to, suppose, you can think of a module as like the whole application is a module. Inside that you'll have submodules like expenses can be a module, strips can be a module, advances can be a module. So they are like technically blocks which have no interdependencies, more or less. They can be interdependencies, but the coupling is actually very less. Okay. So, okay, finally it's stuff, and this is what Angular gives you by default. Okay. So in the Bootstrap, we can see that the first module, which first component which got loaded is the app component.html. Okay. And the corresponding TS file. So corresponding app component is defined in the app.component.ts. Okay. So you might be not used to seeing something weird like this, but I'll just go through what is written over here. At the rate of component, this is a decorator. Okay. So in AngularJS, you used to have directives and stuff in earlier, and later on you have components, right? So similar to AngularJS, in Angular, the definition of component is the same. It means a developer-defined custom HTML tag. Okay. So it's basically whenever you're creating a component or something like, you're essentially creating a new HTML tag, which does something that you define. Okay. And what would be the selector of this thing? App root. App root. So if you look at the index.html, app root over here. Okay. So this is the custom defined HTML tag that we have created, which is being used. Okay. And the corresponding template of this component, that is app component HTML, which is defined over here. The corresponding style sheet of the component, which is defined over here. Okay. Okay, enough of theory right now. Let's do something. Okay. So right now, this is the file which is getting rendered because we are loading up app component. Okay. Let's clear this off and let's just try something in H1 there. Let's do a hello. Live server is a bit bad, it's a bit slow something. But okay. So I now have now something inside my first base level component. But normally you would not be wanting this, right? Normally you would be wanting a web application with multiple pages and multiple components inside every page. Okay. So when you're working with Angular, you have to understand the concept of controllers is no longer there. Everything is a component. Okay. Like everything is technically a directive, a more like, but the concept is that is you don't have controllers or you don't have an MVC style of structure anymore. Everything works with components, right? So so the first question comes, how do you create a component? So Angular CLI comes in to become very helpful over here. So if you're inside the folder where you have your Angular application, you do ng generate component. Let's call this home component. Okay, just home. And the good thing was Angular CLI will create this whole thing for you, the whole component definition, the base, right? So you get this component right over here. Okay. But before you can actually use this component, the first thing you need to do is you need to declare it in the application. Also, the good thing about Angular CLI is whenever you create a component using the CLI, it adds it to the declaration. So without this declaration, this component won't work. Okay. Right now, so let's go to the home component and see what is there. I have app home. I have a corresponding template. I have a corresponding styling page. So how do I use this thing? I just copy app home. I go to component HTML. I come over here and resolve the application. Homework, which is over here. So whatever is inside this component is getting loaded over here. Okay. So what if I want few more pages, right? So I have the home component. I want suppose profile page, and I want a feed. Suppose. So you would be doing the same thing, generating two components and feed. Now you have three components which correspond to three pages, and you want to be able to route to the corresponding. Okay. So if you want to route somewhere, the first thing you have to do is to use a particular HTML component which is already ready-made to Angular. It's called router output. Router output. Now, once you have router output over here, the next thing you have to do is go to the app routing module. Okay. Inside app routing module, you can define a path and correspondingly set up a component. It will come together. I know this is a lot right now, but this will come together once you see this in action. File component, and you will have a path. I had home, I had profile. I need the feed here. Component. Okay. Added these three things. Ideally, I should be able to access the home component would come up by default, and I should be able to access profile and feed with a slash. That is. So the same header is there, but whatever was in the place of router outlet got replaced. Okay. So any corresponding path I choose, if I choose speed, the corresponding this portion would get replaced by feed. Okay. So you see, I'm able to create custom HTML tags also with components and also define them at parent level as components. Okay. So what if I want something inside the home component? Okay. I want the home taskbox, or I want a calendar inside my home. Okay. So let's see. Maybe one way of going around that. So let's install the full calendar over that. You'll see where Angular starts getting very powerful. Very quick. Okay. So I'm just going to full calendar, going to and installing the default package. Remember, anytime you install a package, you would have to rerun ng-serve because the compilation needs to go through all of these files. It will seem like it's working, but there would be a bunch of things breaking, and you won't be able to understand why that is happening. So it's best if you anytime you install a new package or something like that, just restart ng-serve. Okay. And so there is a mistake inside the full calendar documentation. That is, it also needs the full calendar interactable wala plugin. I will just quickly find for that. Okay, guys, are you able to follow what I'm saying till now?
Yes. Yes.
Because I'm running through a bunch of things very quickly. But
yes, it is difficult to follow everything, but the main picture is easy to grasp.
Yeah, I have one doubt. So compared to React and Angular, whatever you're explaining, it is almost similar. Like if you consider React library also, It has
Yes.
a React. Why do you prefer Angular over React?
Okay. So React does not have the concept of services. Right? So if you want to maintain state, or if you want, so think of it like this. Um, uh, so if you're using a very large, creating a very large application with React, you would be facing a few problems in building a few parts in a few things. The first thing which would you would face problems with is a if you look at routing over here, so right now I have three components. What if this becomes 30? What if this becomes 100? So if you look at our file application itself, you will see like there are maybe a very large number of routes, right? And for an individual user, like he uses maybe 4 or 5 of those routes. Okay. So you're essentially loading up a lot of JavaScript for people who will probably not be using it at all. So for React, you kind of have to do the lazy loading manually,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it React provides a lazy loading, no?
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
yes.
But yes, my point being, React, if you're using React router, doing lazy loading is a bit more difficult because you would need to go to Webpack for the configuration and do it yourself. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Uh,
And this
Angular,
React is one-way binding, I guess.
React in
So it's
Angular
one-way.
also, you have the choice of the two-way binding, but it's we don't use it. Okay.
Hmm.
So having using two-way binding is a strict no-no, even though it's available inside like and your Angular. So and the other thing in which is the major differentiator between Angular and React is say Angular you have the concept of services, right? So you have services and RxJS which come in the place of Redux, which is used in React. Okay. So why do you want to use services plus these things instead of Redux? The problem with Redux and these things are even though so React, the whole Redux wala concept, the whole mutator of and those things, you have to come from a very functional programming with a background. So if you're not used to it, it has a learning curve. Okay. So so suppose you're making API calls. Okay. So in API calls in Redux, the first choice would be to use Redux thunks. Okay. So
Mhm.
Redux thunks, what it does is say every time you make a mutation, you make a API call. So every mutation can have multiple submutations. But this becomes very complex very quickly. So the solution for this is using something like Redux sagas. Okay. But if you use Redux sagas, you'll see like it gets unnecessarily complicated very fast. So but in Angular, the it's the learning curve in the beginning is higher, but once you reach a certain once you have a fair understanding of how it works, the it doesn't get more complex than that because you have a very good distinction on how certain things on how certain portions work. So React, I would say, is much better for applications which won't grow beyond a certain size, that is maybe 30 pages or 40 pages or even 50 pages. But for enterprise applications which grow up to maybe 200 250 pages or something like this, it's much easier using Angular because you have lesser chances of going wrong because Angular strictly defines a bunch of stuff. You don't have a way around around doing those things. But in React, you have a bunch of ways of going around certain things, which can lead to certain problems when you're doing development on a scale. Okay. So this is my opinion. Many people use React also in enterprise cases, that is with large number of applications, large number of pages and stuff like that. But this is just my opinion. Ideally, it's a preference or like it's a choice between people who are more skilled in a particular framework. So since we already have certain exposure to Angular JS, it makes sense for us to move directly to Angular, right? But you can ideally move over to Vue and React like similarly. But the problem is you would again have to learn state management and those things in a different pattern.
Hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah. So I'll also add this. So right now, what I'm doing right now is I'm adding a component. Okay. So full calendar is essentially, like I said, a component which gives you a full like it gives you a full calendar. But my point being that if you want to create an application which works with a schedule or something like this, would you want to use something like full calendar because it makes creating a calendar which has like timesheets, which has dates and those things in it, right? So you can do so like similar to what we use UI grid, right? The same thing we can do via implementation, but the thing is already ready-made. So it makes sense over there to use something which is ready-made and like modify it to our needs. So right now, so once this full calendar thing is running on, we go to app module. We'll start. So I'll explain what is happening over here. I won't spend time writing it behind. So, full calendar. Yeah, and so full calendar works in a very plugin-ish form of system. Okay. So I will explain how that works. So I'll explain what is happening. So so Angular has this thing which is called a module, has a module-based system. Okay. So what I mean by module-based system, I mean that every portion that you have which is independent, you can actually chunk them together into a module, right? So what are modules? Modules are a bunch of components. Like it has a bunch of components, it has a bunch of providers. So any module is essentially has the same pattern. Declarations may you put in components that are internal to the particular module. Imports may you import from other modules. Providers may you put services. Exports may you put out modules that you want to export to other services. Okay. So this gives a very unique pattern that you cannot export certain services per se, but you can export certain module components on it, right? You can export services also. I'm not doing it. So it's never a use case that you have to have like services exported from a given service. Preferably, you would want them at the parent level whenever you are exporting service. Okay. But you will see when we use. So right now we are using a very UI specific libraries. But later on, I'll also cover a few use cases by using Firebase. Okay. At that point of time, you'll see why why I say you can export services also, because the library which we will be using for Firebase Angular Fire would cover that. Okay. So and before you ask the question why I consider Firebase, it's like because see, I can ideally use File API, but I don't want to. The point is to have these sessions as much framework agnostic and as much like certain API agnostic, so you're able to understand how to scratch together an application from if you have an idea or something. Right? So, so while this is going on, I'll cover what just happened over here. So we imported the full calendar module from full calendar Angular. This is a wrapper library that the developers of full calendar have made. Dategrid plugin and interaction plugin are something which is given by full calendar. So full calendar has a plugin system where certain methods and certain stuff is just made available when you import that particular plugin. Okay. And app component is it was already defined. It was defined up, but so I just copied it twice so that if you move to one app component corresponding to this thing that we have over here. Okay. And I imported the full calendar module over here so that this component can be used by inside the. So if I want to use the whatever is exported inside full calendar module inside my components here, I would have to import this module also. Okay. This module wala thing will become is very confusing right now. I understand it's similar to Java packages, but you would be getting a hang of this once you get your hands up with 30. Okay. We would so I'll cover a folder structure wala thing in a later on session where you would be seeing a whole creating a whole module likely inside your application, the proper folder structure that we would also use. Right? So here may I'll copy of the full calendar. So what the full calendar module gives us is a full calendar component. See, and what the full calendar component is basically a calendar component which has the whole display. So, and the corresponding calendar option. As this is Angular, you also have to import it from unless you don't use it. Oh, see, I got the calendar itself, right? So now if I want, so you see, like, so I just import a calendar component from somewhere and I hope the whole component runs. The good thing is like I can create a wrapper over this and export it just as easily and use it somewhere. Okay. So let's make this something where the events are actually show up on the screen because probably are like quite old. This came up right now. So if I want something to happen on click of a particular day cell, I can just easily find a click event over here. Date click, and I have let me like the on date click. Okay. You might see that the syntax over here for the methods is a bit different, but this is very similar to ES6 for the syntax that you might see. Okay. So and so since this is a class, so whatever method I refer to inside, I would have to refer to this. Okay. So this dot on date click. Now there is a complication over here. If I just write date click may I just pass in a function. Date click takes in a function. I just pass in this function. The problem which would happen is whatever reference, if I use something, if I have a variable over here, I want to set it on picking of this variable, that this reference would actually not be that thing, but this reference would be this object. Okay. This is because this is because this is JavaScript, by the way, this is not TypeScript. But whenever you have a method inside the object which is passed by reference, and that method is called from the inside, which is via date click because it would be an emitted from inside, this reference would change to this thing, right? So you would ideally have to write something like this. This just got very complicated very fast, I understand. So the other preferred option would be to go like this. So you pass a method over here directly where you call this dot on the on date click and pass it. Okay. But this too is not the best approach. Ideally, you would want to understand what is happening over here. Okay. So bind, what it does is like in JavaScript, you have the option that anytime you have a method, like suppose, let's say function add, okay, and this function add, it adds returns this dot a plus. So this is JavaScript. This is not in context of this thing. Or B. So if you run this function by itself, it will break. Okay. But if you run this inside the prototype of an object which is already has A and B as properties, this would work. And how would you attach the reference of an object to this? You would use bind or apply on those ones. Okay. That is why those methods exist. So you would do add dot bind, and this object name you can pass in a colon 12, b colon 47. Okay. And this would call this method by referencing this object in the place of this. Okay. But this never comes in use except for this particular portion. So just think of it as syntax issue. Okay. So anytime I click on a date, you see the events are now getting constant. So this method is getting hit. Where E, I'm getting the corresponding data. So you understand, like I can create open up a model right now from inside here. I can do a bunch of things from inside here. So this was just a demonstration of how to create a very basic Angular application, how to do basic routing, how to add extra libraries and stuff like that. Okay. I understand this might be a lot of content for just one session, but yes, but how much time? 12 o'clock. Okay. Do you guys have any more energy? Because I want to cover a few more things. It will take 10-15 minutes.
Yes. Sure. Go on.
Okay. The rest of the portions I can do, I'll do directional concept. Directional concept. Yes. Okay. So I'll cover a few basics of functional programming over here, because without it, we won't be able to understand what is happening when we come to RX. Okay. So what is functional programming? So before we start with functional programming, we have to cover a few definitions on definitions, right? So because it's functional programming is more of a like scientific tool than actual programming paradigm. And it's actually quite useful in a bunch of things, but it's better if we understand. So so in functional programming, first thing we talk about are functions. Okay. So and the first term you would see when you read about something are pure functions. So what are pure functions? Pure functions are functions where you put in inputs, and so given the same input, you always get the same output. Okay. There is no chance of the output changing if the inputs remain the same. Okay. So if I pass 1 and 2 over here, I'll always get 3. There's no chance that in one case I may get 3 and one case I may get 4. Okay. You see things like this would always be the case. But think in AngularJS, in the applications that we write. Any function that we have, most of the functions that we have would have interference from variables coming from outside, which may be some flag which is there, is constant present, and we'll put the plus game plus dot is constant present question mark 1 colon 2 plus. So this is the kind of stuff that we write to, and these things remove the purity of a function because you have external influences working on a function. Okay. So that means anytime you run this function, you have no guarantee that you get the same output. Okay. So so if a function has is not affected by external stuff, it is called a pure function. There's also another thing which has to happen inside a function to make it to make it pure, which is it should not have side effects, right? So suppose I have this add function only, okay, and I have this is so suppose I had this is to present this sort of very Boolean output. Okay. So if I write inside this, if A2 equal to 2 is to present, becomes so you might be thinking, so this is another thing which removes the purity of this function. Okay. The function becomes impure because it's doing something outside what it's returned. Ideally, a function should always influence what it returns, nothing else. Okay. So we still have to do it in certain cases because without doing that, a bunch of things we would be unable to do. But the idea is, if you're doing functional programming, you would want to isolate places where you actually do operations. That is, places where you do side effects. Other methods have to be kind of like pure functions. So why take an approach like this? Why have pure functions? What are the benefits that you actually get from pure functions for which you would actually want to use pure functions? The benefit you get is like you can do memoization. Okay. So suppose a plus A1 plus A2 is a very expensive operation. It's not this. Maybe it's a very complicated mathematics. It's a encryption or something. Or maybe even it's a mini tree search or something. Okay. It takes certain amount of time. Okay. If you memorize this function from dynamic programming, that is, if you have a dictionary from outside dictionary, let's say dictionary is equal to curly braces, and if you have something like dictionary, bracket में arguments, so you do something like this. Simplify, will directly return this thing. Now the question comes that this is still impure, right? So how does this help? So like, it's not, if you're not using, so else you add. I'm just showing a use case for memorization over here. The proper pure function definition of memorization will come. So when you're doing expensive operations, having a pattern like this makes more sense because you are not doing the same calculations again and again. And this is the kind of what we do in dynamic programming, right? We define a problem that is already solved, and once we have a solution for the sub-problem, we use it everywhere. That way, number of cases that we actually have to solve reduces drastically, right? So we are technically doing caching over here of the function. Okay. But you'll see over here I had to define an external variable, I had to inject it inside this thing. So this created a very messy function, first of all, where add does not do addition, but does a bunch of extra things. That is, it creates a side effect. It is affected by the side effect and also affects the external side effects, right? So is there a workaround for this? Is there a way that we can still make this pure but not get affected by it? Yes, we'll come to that. Before that, I'll cover a few more things. Okay. In JavaScript, another interesting thing is that every function is a first class object. Okay. So if you have something like this, a comma b return a plus b, you can technically do a dot a add dot a equal to a. Okay. I can demonstrate this. So if you have a function, say var f is equal to function a comma b, b. So f is the actual function. So you can do f dot a equal to 1. If you do f dot a, you get 1. If you have f, you get the function. Okay. And this might seem very unintuitive because normally in most other programming languages you do not have you don't have a syntax like this. But in JavaScript you have this because functions are objects, which is a very difficult concept to grasp your head around. But once you actually think about it, it actually makes life simpler for a bunch of things. That means you can pass in functions to different objects, so a different function. So function. So suppose I have a function called memories. Okay. And this takes in a new function f. Okay. And so inside memoirs, I define dictionary equal to W. Okay. So so when I'm memorizing function f, I have the option J. Anytime this function is called, I'll return a new function. I'll return a new function. This function comes. What was the syntax? Return a new function. Is return. Which has arguments and this return of entity. But this is not the case for memorization, right? So what we want to do for memorization is dictionary we have suppose I'll just do a very light level here. This won't work for if this exists. If it doesn't, yeah. This might seem very confusing right now. I'll explain what is happening. Okay. So first thing that we are using, we are passing in a function inside a function. Okay. Which is only possible in JavaScript because functions are first-class objects. Okay. Once we have this function inside, we are creating a new function. So memoize is taking a function as an argument and is also dynamically creating a function. So memoize is what we call in functional programming world a higher order function. Okay. It's a function which creates new functions. Okay. And inside this, you have a variable called dictionary. Okay. And first, you're checking if so. This new function that is created, it's always assumed that the function which is passed inside memoize takes only two arguments. There are versions where you can use spread operator and you can use arguments to declare this generically. I don't remember them. I don't memorize them, so I am not able to come up with them right now. But you would be able to find out a generic term which would work for any function with any number of arguments. So given a function, it returns a function which takes in two arguments. Okay. It checks if that function value is available in the dictionary or not. If it's available, then return the dictionary, a value from the dictionary. If it's not, set inside the dictionary, and it will get you the value from the dictionary itself. So it only calculates when it needs to. So suppose now I can technically do memoize of any function which takes in two arguments, any function, and if the argument and now the question comes, when this function is returned. When this function, so suppose I have something like var add is equal to function a comma b equal a plus b. Let's b. So I have var memoize that, which is technically memoize add. Right now you have memoize that, which is basically a new function you create by combining these two functions. You use the higher order function on this thing, you got a new function which has this. But the question is like memoize function has now stopped when you get this function. So where is dictionary? Where does this exist? So dictionary exists inside the closure of this function. So when this function is created, dictionary is a variable which lives inside memory but is not accessible from everywhere except from inside the context of this function. Okay. So this is what JavaScript closures are. If you create a new function and you have a variable existing outside its context but accessible from it right now, and even if the parent context disappears, the variables which have been accessed over here are still accessible, and they exist outside the context of any memory except for the context of this function. Okay. It is one of the harder concepts in JavaScript to wrap your head around, but it leads to fascinating patterns that you can create a decorators kind of. Because memoize over here is technically a decorator in JavaScript right now. Okay. So this is technically what you would call using a closure to create a higher order function. Okay. Another interesting pattern you would want to use, because you are now familiar with the concept of higher order function, is currying. Okay. Now you have add. Maybe you want something of a method where you want to create functions like add 5, maybe add 10 or something. So how do you do that? The question is, you create a function called, you can create do this with another higher order function, or you can create a curry that wala function. Just do the curry that wala function. I'll keep the higher order function to curry any method like as homework. Maybe you guys can try it out later. So let's call this curry add. And what curry dash does is it takes in the first argument and it returns a new function which takes in the second argument and returns add of a command. So the syntax got very weird very fast. But what does curry that? What advantage does it give you? You can create new functions now. Add 5. You will curry that or add 7. Curry that 7. Okay. So add 5 is a new function that you can add 12 and you can get 5 plus 12 17. If you use add 7 over here, you can do 12 over here, you will get 19. So currying is also a very interesting concept where you get the infamous, what do you call this? It's called in the mathematical world as Watt notation, but I'll not go with that one. But the idea is like you have the way to modify functions which takes in 2 arguments at the same time and convert it to functions which take in them separately. That is, they keep on taking arguments till you actually complete the total number of stuff. And you can create functions out of those functions. Okay. This gives rise to a very powerful paradigm of currying. And in combination with higher order functions, you can technically create a bunch of combination functions which does a bunch of things. Okay. So this gives a very light. So see, another term that you would come in inside, you'll see inside function program is composition. Composition is nothing but calling a bunch of functions one after the other. That is, we have add, you have subtract, you have multiply, suppose. Okay. Each of them taking suppose like 2 arguments. Okay. So if I convert them to add 5 sub 12 mul 2, and then I combine them together in this format, I technically have a definition of an algebraic expression, right? Kind of. But you might not want something like this because this is very difficult to do. So you would take in the methods as like add 5, sub 12, mul 2, and use them inside a compose function to create a new function which does basically this thing. So it gives you an x where which is basically this thing. Okay. So that is what composition is. Okay. But it's more of a like something which is fancied and more useful, but it has its applications. Right. So so this covers around about the very, very, very basic stages of functional typing. There are a bunch of other things if you don't want to cover. You can technically go to Professor Frisbee's guide on functional programming. It's available for free as a ebook. Okay, so do you guys have any questions? Is anyone awake right now?
Huh?
Okay, I thought everyone fell asleep. Okay, were you guys able to understand this whole thing?
For the most part.
Not the composition, rest I understood.
Does the composition? Okay. So tell me. So I can explain this thing again if you want. Like it's not very difficult. Like I can explain this again. So the concept is inside JavaScript, every function is an object. Okay. So you can treat it like an object. You can pass it into functions. You can pass it inside. You can create add dot and add more properties to it and stuff like that. Okay. So the idea is like if I pass a function to another function, what happens? Like you can technically modify the function in some way. You can create an entirely new function out of it, and those are kind of things, right? So the idea is like over here, what curry does is instead of so I'm calling the function add over here, but instead of taking them separately, I'm causing the arguments to be taken separately. So see, you guys have to try your hand at this, like try it using this a little bit, and it will come naturally. I understand this feels very abstract right now, but once you guys use this a little bit, it will become very intuitive.
I think filter works this way in AngularJS.
Filter, maps, and reduce, I think.
Yes, map filter reduce a function of Angular. Yes.
But the filter actually takes one input, I mean one parameter.
Yes,
and
yes,
then it will return a function, so which takes up another parameter.
Yes. So which is basically so JavaScript does it that way because it's kind of easier to do. So if you see the most of the functional programming libraries which are there, Lodash and underscore are most popular because they follow that sort of pattern, which is a chain syntax. Okay. So that dot map dot filter dot reduce. This is called this is what we call a design pattern in JavaScript. Okay. So we can do, you remember the collection, you see if you have seen the collections that we have, they kind of do the same thing. Okay. So it's basically having a set of variables, a set of an object as implicit when you're using it. Okay. In the case of arrays, the elements of the array are implicit and the function works on them. Okay. That's why but it's technically you can kind of rewrite it as filter where the first argument is an array and the second argument is the function. Okay. That way filter becomes a pure function. But here, since you're having the whole object as implicit, you kind of are merging both of those cases. But still, filter map and reduce still work in the same way.
Is this same as decorators or is it something different?
With decorators, the closest thing you would have to decorators is this thing, higher order functions in JavaScript. Okay? Like you see, I decorated this function add with memoization. So it would be so in Java it would be similar to you doing something like this. Okay. And if I want to use like caching maybe for this, maybe caching. If I want to do currying, maybe currying, this sort of thing. In Java or other languages, you would do this sort of thing. In JavaScript, you have no other way of doing this except for doing this. This too is a design pattern. Okay, in JavaScript, which is the so higher order functions can be used. So this is the higher order function being used as a decorator. Okay, so you would be able to find numerous references or uses of this as decorators in online articles. If you have, so just try it out a few times. You would understand what is happening. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So okay. This will be about it. Do you guys have any other stuff to ask? Share books and links. Yes, I'll share a book. I have a.
You can put it in book surgery. You can put it in brain surgery. Yes, brain surgery.
It's already there in brain surgery. I posted it like maybe a few months back. But I'll see. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess you. So guys, try these things out, and in case you have any questions and stuff, feel free to ping me. Okay. I'll be trying to have these screencasts every day, perhaps, but it's an impossibility given the schedule and stuff. So if not possible, I'll likely put on the channel when we are having these sessions. I'll keep them recorded. So in case you guys have any questions or if you guys have any stuff that you want to try out, feel free to drop into these sessions. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Someone was saying something.
Hey sir, can you please keep a Git repo of this file so that we can keep adding on this and like, look up to the code?
A memoization is ka?
When you like start writing things, it will be helpful.
Got it. Yeah, ठीक है. I'll do from next session onwards because this one is a little bit of shit.
Sure.
ठीक है.
Thank you, Baba.
Thank you.
I'll try this out and I'll come back with doubts.
Man, एकदम. Try out, check out. So once you have context of this, you can check out the list views wala code. I've used like the same patterns in list views throughout. Like most of the stuff works like that. Higher order functions per higher order function.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
ठीक है.
Bye bye.
তরুণ বাবু কি খবর?
ভিডিও লিংকটা দিস তো, মাঝখানে একটা জায়গায় আমি হারিয়ে ফেলে দিয়ে দেখতে হবে ওই অ্যাঙ্গুলার